Welcome to another live stream with the St. Philip Institute of Catechesis and Evangelization. My name is Luke Heinschel. I am the Director of Communications for the St. Philip Institute, and I'm really glad to be talking about today's subject with the sex abuse scandal in the Church, particularly because I'm such a big fan of Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI. I loved him as Joseph Ratzinger before he became the Holy Pope, and of course, I was among the many to be very disappointed when he abdicated his papacy. So he's come out recently with a letter that was published in a Bavarian magazine for clerics, and he addresses the sex abuse scandals. And he talks about the origins and why this is happening, and he also talks about a way to move forward. So I want to kind of go through his letter that he wrote. It's long, so I'm just going to skip through it and read a few excerpts just to kind of get the gist of what he's saying. He opens up by saying that he did contact His Holiness Pope Francis, as well as the Secretary of State for the Vatican, Cardinal Parolin. And he says this letter is divided into three parts. The first part, he aims to present briefly the wider societal context in which the abuse crisis has arisen. So not just within the Church, but within the larger society, especially Western society. In the second part, he says, I aim to point out the effects of this situation on the formation of priests, and so how the effects of the wider society impacts priests in the seminary. And then third, he says that he'd like to develop some perspectives for a proper response on the part of the Church. How does the Church handle these sex abuse scandals? How do we, the faithful, handle these sex abuse scandals? And it's very, very interesting, so I'll just go right into it. He says, the matter begins with state-prescribed and supported introduction of children and youths into the nature of sexuality. He talks about the state of this problem in Germany, but I think this is very prevalent in America as well. We introduce our children to things of sexual nature, whether it be pornography or sex ed in school or any other sort of something of a sexual nature. We introduce that to our children at younger and younger stages. And this has a really, really significant impact on a child's psyche. I think a lot of the studies today tend to say that, at least for boys, their first time they see hardcore pornography is when they're like 10, 11 years old, which is really, it's a terrible, terrible phenomena in our society, and it's quite widespread. So he goes on to talk about the sexual revolution of the 1960s. And he says, among the freedoms that the revolution of 1968 sought to fight for was this all-out sexual freedom, one which no longer conceded any norms. So we have a society that has fought diligently for a type of freedom of sexuality which forgets about societal norms. And it's not really freedom, it's not real freedom, because of course real freedom is the ability to do what's good. What society fought for in the 60s was the ability to do what we want. And ultimately, if you're a Christian, you know that if we sin, then we are slaves to sin. Jesus says this in the Gospel of John. Those who sin are slaves to sin. And so our society has forgotten this. We live in a post-Christian world, after Christian. Our world is after Christianity. So he says, among the freedoms that the revolution of 1968 sought to fight for was this all-out sexual freedom. So it's anybody can do anything they want with their sexuality. There's no rules. You're not allowed to judge anyone for doing what they want with their sexuality. You certainly can't say that homosexual unions are immoral. You can never say that a man who thinks he's a woman is actually a man. You could never say these things in our society because they're they're offensive. But more importantly, they impinge upon our society's sexual freedom, right? So this is where our society is going today. And he says part of the general appearance of the revolution of 1968 was that pedophilia was also diagnosed and as allowed and appropriate. So this is inherently part of it. If people can do whatever they want with their sexuality, then who is anyone to say that pedophilia is wrong? If a grown person and a child both consents, well, that's part of this sexual freedom type of philosophy. It's a very natural conclusion. Pope Emeritus Benedict says, "I've always wondered how young people in this situation could approach the priesthood and accept it with all of its ramifications." And so here he's kind of hinting towards part of the problem here is that for some period of time, there was young men entering the priesthood having been already slaves to certain sexuality, certain kinds of sexual sins, already slaves to this ideology of sexual freedom, which of course is not real freedom. Pope Benedict says the extensive collapse of the next generation of priests in those years and the very high number of laicizations were a consequence of all these developments. So the wider society had an impact on the way we actually formed our priests. So Pope Benedict goes on from this wider societal situation, he goes on to talk about the situation within Catholicism. And he says, at the same time, independently of this development, Catholic moral theology suffered a collapse that rendered the Church defenseless against these changes in society. And so in times past, when the society was wrong, Christianity came to the rescue to provide real, valuable morals. Christianity came to set people free from their slavery to sin. And we've always thought of it as freedom, even though it's a certain kind of slavery. So Pope Benedict is saying that in an almost unique situation, Catholic moral theology was having a similar crisis within itself, and it made it very difficult for the Church to be able to come to society's rescue. So he says, until the Second Vatican Council, Catholic moral theology was largely founded on natural law. So we didn't just go to the Ten Commandments. We didn't simply look at the Beatitudes for our morality. Those are really important parts of morality. But fundamentally, we looked at the way God created us. He created us as male and female. We looked at the way He created us with a spiritual soul. So we have our origin and our end are God Himself as our creator, as the ultimate goal of our lives. Perfect happiness is just loving God. That's all. That's the easiest way to describe what perfect happiness is. So we used to be founded on this natural law about the way we were created. In the Council's struggle, Pope Benedict says, for a new understanding of divine revelation, principally sacred scripture, but also sacred tradition and the way the magisterium works with that, the natural law option was largely abandoned. And a moral theology based entirely on the Bible was demanded. And so sometime around the Second Vatican Council, not within the Second Vatican Council's documents, mind you, but sometime around there, Catholic moral theology was searching for a sola scriptura type of morality. He doesn't go into the reasons for that, but he just states that that's the case. It's very interesting. And he says, in the end, it was chiefly the hypothesis that morality was to be exclusively determined by the purposes of human action that prevailed. While the old phrase, the ends justify the means, were not confirmed in this crude form, he says, its way of thinking had become definitive. Anybody would have still rejected the idea that the ends justify the means in morality, but we still ended up thinking that way anyway. Consequently, he says, there could no longer be anything that constitutes an absolute good, any more than anything that's fundamentally evil. There could only be relative value judgments. There no longer was the absolute good, but only the relatively better, the contingent on the moment and the circumstances. So this is a huge departure from what the church teaches about morality. The church teaches that there are three sources of a moral decision. So whether or not something is moral, we have three sources to determine it. We have what the act is, or the object, the action itself. We have the intention of the person acting, the intentions, what are their goal, and the circumstances surrounding the action. So this is the way the Catholic Church has always defined the sources of morality. But Pope Benedict here is saying that we kind of abandoned that. We abandoned the natural law. We abandoned the three sources of morality. The only thing that judges morality, the only source of morality, is the moment or the circumstances, perhaps the end goal, the person's intentions. So basically, if you have good intentions, then you're not going to do anything bad. That's this idea, but it's patently false. You can have the best intentions, but still do something horribly evil. We find this all over the place in history, people with really good intentions doing horribly, horribly evil things. He goes on to say, Pope John Paul II, who knew very well the situation of moral theology and followed it closely, commissioned work on an encyclical that would set these things right again. So Pope John Paul II started working on a letter that he hoped would set things right, that would clarify these confusions. It was published under the title Veritatis Splendor, or The Splendor of the Truth, in 1993, and it triggered vehement backlashes on the part of moral theologians. So within Catholicism, we have this huge struggle between, traditional Catholic moral theology on the one hand, and a sort of newer, kind of bending to the age sort of moral theology. Before Veritatis Splendor, he says, the Catechism of the Catholic Church had already persuasively presented in a systematic fashion the Catholic Church's teachings on morality. And he's right. The Catechism of the Catholic Church is an excellent resource to get, the Catholic idea of what is good and evil and how do we determine which is which. He goes on to talk about how the encyclical Veritatis Splendor was published in 1993, and it included the determination that there are some kinds of actions which can never become good. There are some kinds of actions which are intrinsically evil. So remember the three sources of morality: the action itself, the intention, and the circumstances. So some actions may be bad in some circumstances, maybe they're bad with some intentions, or maybe they can be good depending on the intentions and circumstances. For example, if you're going to go feed the poor, if your intention is to be praised for being, someone who goes out and feeds the poor, well, that's a bad intention. It actually makes the action itself morally wrong. That doesn't mean you shouldn't go feed the poor. It just means that you should feed the poor for the right reason. We should feed the poor because we love the poor, because we love God. Or what if you're going to feed the poor, but you have responsibilities at home that you're shirking? You really should be spending time with your children, with your spouse, but you're putting aside those obligations to go feed the poor. Well, then feeding the poor is not a good action because the circumstances are bad, the intention might be bad. But so there are some actions which no matter how good the circumstances are, no matter how good the intentions are, the action itself is intrinsically evil. It's evil in and of itself. And so Catholics have always known that we can't do those things. For example, killing the innocent is an intrinsically evil action. It doesn't matter how good your intentions are. It doesn't matter how dire your circumstances are. We can never morally kill an innocent person. We can never commit murder in that way. Doesn't matter the intentions, doesn't matter the circumstances. This is why abortion is wrong. Even in the case of rape or incest or any other such circumstance, abortion is still wrong because it's still the murder of an innocent life. So it's intrinsically evil. So Pope Benedict says that Veritatis Splendor reinforced this idea that some actions are intrinsically evil. So Pope John Paul II in Veritatis Splendor, he talks about this question of intrinsic evil in paragraphs 79 through 83 of Veritatis Splendor. And just like there are some things that are intrinsically evil, there are other things, Pope Benedict says, that are so good that we can't trade them for anything else. He says there are goods that are never subject to trade-offs. So for example, the tenets of our faith, no matter what the circumstances are, we can't blaspheme. We can't reject our Lord because he is preeminently and perfectly good, in the same way that killing an innocent person is intrinsically evil. So he says there are goods that are never subject to trade-offs. These are values which must never be abandoned for a greater value and even surpass the preservation of physical life. There are actually things that we should die for, our faith being one of them. He says there is martyrdom. God is about more than mere physical survival. A life that would be bought by the denial of God, a life that is based on a final lie, is a non-life. Martyrdom, witnessing to our faith, is absolutely essential to our lives. And there's nothing greater than our union with God. There's nothing that we should give up, or there's nothing that we should give up union with God to attain. Nothing in this world, nothing in the world to come. He says martyrdom is a basic category of Christian existence. He says it's the very essence of Christianity, and that's what's at stake. He goes on to say the hypothesis that the magisterium of the Church should have final competence or infallibility only in matters concerning the faith also gained widespread acceptance. So he's saying that people rejected the Church's teachings on morality, saying the Church can only do articles of faith, not morals. In this view, questions concerning morality should not fall within the scope of infallible decisions of the magisterium of the Church. This is hugely problematic. The Bible talks all about morality. Sacred tradition passes on a certain form of morality, a certain way of living life, a certain being like Christ. It's the magisterium's role, unique role, to help us understand Scripture and tradition. So the magisterium inherently has a role to play in the questions concerning morality and ethics. So initial ecclesial reactions, Pope Benedict goes on to talk about how this impacted the seminaries. He says, in various seminaries, homosexual cliques were established, which acted more or less openly and significantly changed the climate in the seminaries. So seminaries are supposed to be groups of men who are living in perfect and perpetual continence until their ordination, and yet he's saying that these homosexual cliques were established. This is highly dangerous. It's highly dangerous for the development of our seminarians. He says, At the common meals, seminarians and pastoral specialists, lay pastoral specialists, ate together, the married among the laymen sometimes accompanied by their wives and children, and on occasion by their girlfriends. The climate in this seminary could not provide support for the preparation to priestly vocation. Our seminaries need to be places where men can go to become priests. This is so important. If our men are not being formed in the seminary for priesthood, then they're not going to be good priests. We're going to have a whole generation, and we saw a whole generation where there was corruption within the clergy. This is the fundamental nature of the crisis. Poor seminarian formation, poor moral formation. He says, indeed, in many parts of the church, conciliar attitudes were understood to mean, so the attitude of the Second Vatican Council, or some people call it the spirit of Vatican II. Conciliar attitudes were understood to mean having a critical or negative attitude towards the existing tradition. So the Catholic Church is built on the tradition that Christ handed on to the apostles, especially the tradition of Christ himself being handed on from generation to generation. And yet, people began to think that the Second Vatican Council was alienating the old tradition to make way for a new order, in a sense. He says, perhaps it is worth mentioning that in not a few seminaries, students caught reading Pope Benedict, my books were considered unsuitable for the priesthood. Pope Benedict, one of the greatest minds of the 20th century, students caught reading his books were considered unsuitable for the priesthood. The Spirit of the Liturgy is an incredible, incredible book. You know, I think every seminarian, every priest should read it. And yet, if you were caught reading that, you were considered not suitable for priesthood. This is so backwards. He goes on to say, in addition, however, there was a fundamental problem in the perception of criminal law. Only so-called guarantorism was still regarded as conciliar. So this means that above all, the rights of the accused, that is, priests accused of sexual misconduct, above all, the rights of the accused had to be guaranteed to an extent that that factually excluded any conviction at all. As a counterweight against the often inadequate defense options available to accused theologians, their right to defense by way of guarantorism was extended to such an extent that convictions were hardly possible. So an emphasis was placed on the rights of priests who are accused of sexual misconduct. And that's totally fine. We do need people to be considered innocent until proven guilty. This is an important tenet. You know, we can't just start punishing people as soon as they're accused of something. But at the same time, we should prioritize goodness and truth, getting to the bottom of these issues above protecting somebody. So he says, great goods such as the faith are equally important. Great goods such as the faith are equally important. What ultimately is suffering in the priest abuse scandal? People's faith. Many people, it may be as an excuse, maybe very genuinely, but it just seems like there's so many people who reject the Catholic Church because of the sexual abuse crisis. This is heartbreaking, but it's what a lot of people think. And so the faith is actually harmed by these abusing priests, not just their victims. Their victims are harmed beyond belief, but there's more to the story than even that. He says, if today one puts forward this inherently clear conception, one generally falls on deaf ears when it comes to the protection of the faith as a legal good. This is highly important to consider. He says, in fact, it is important to see that such misconduct by clerics ultimately damages the faith. It damages the faith. Only where faith no longer determines the actions of man are such offenses possible. So that's the second part. How has this affected the church specifically? And so the third part of his letter, Pope Benedict offers a way forward. He says, what must be done? Perhaps we should create another church for things to work out. Let's just make another church. Let's scrap the old and make another one. He says, well, that experiment has already been undertaken in the Protestant Reformation and has already failed. Only obedience and love for our Lord Jesus Christ can point the way. So let us first try and understand anew from within ourselves what the Lord wants and has wanted from us. So here is the primary way that Pope Benedict says we move forward. And I think he's right. We have to focus on the truth. We have to focus on goodness. We have to focus on God above all else. So let us first try to understand anew and from within ourselves what the Lord wants. First, Benedict suggests the following. If we really wanted to summarize very briefly the content of the faith as laid down in the Bible, we might do so by saying that the Lord has initiated a narrative of love with us, and He wants to subsume all creation in it. The Lord has initiated a narrative of love with us, and He wants to subsume all creation in it. God created the world, God created man for the sake of love. Not so that we could be, not so we could have physical pleasures, not so that we could be financially successful. God created the world and us, and each of us as an individual, for the sake of love. Pope Benedict says, learning to love God is therefore the path to human redemption. Learning to love God is the path to human redemption. And ultimately, we have to love God not just as individuals, but as a society. We need to get over our faulty views of morality. We need to get over the sins that we're all slaves to, and we need to figure out how to love God. He says, let us now try to unpack this essential content of God's revelation a little more. We might then say that the first fundamental gift that faith offers us is the certainty that God exists. A world without God is a world without meaning. St. Augustine said that God made us for Himself and that our hearts are restless until they rest in Him. A world without God is a world without meaning. For where then does everything that is come from? In any case, it has no spiritual purpose, Benedict says. It is somehow simply there and has neither any goal or any sense. There's no standards of good or evil. This is the world without a Christian morality. He says, for the world without Christian morality, then only what is stronger than the other can assert itself. This is an interesting phrase because Pope Benedict, Joseph Ratzinger, grew up in Germany in the middle of World War II. He says, then only what is stronger than the other can assert itself. Might makes right. This is a huge problem. If we lose our fundamental dependence on God for our morality, then we inherently give up to the power play. We inherently give up to the morality of whoever is stronger. So if Hitler's in power, then the Holocaust is morally good because Hitler's the strongest, etc. In today's world, adults, politicians, they have the power. They decide what's good and evil. The unborn are expendable because they don't really have the power. They can't decide what's morally good. This is the pro-choice movement. This is the mindset of an abusing priest. He has the power. He gets to choose good and evil. Power is then the only principle. Truth does not count. Natural law is out the window. Truth does not even exist. This is the situation our world is in. In his book, Spirit of the Liturgy, he says something very similar. He says, we must not forget that there's an essential connection between the three orders of worship, law, and ethics. Worship, law, political law specifically, and ethics or morality. I am without a foundation in, law without a foundation in morality becomes injustice. When morality and law do not originate in a Godward perspective, as in towards God, towards the worship of God, when morality and law do not originate in worship in a Godward perspective, they degrade man because they rob him of his highest measure and his highest capacity. They deprive him of any vision of the infinite and eternal. This seeming liberation, like the 1960s, subjects man to the dictatorship of the ruling majority, to shifting human standards, which inevitably end up doing him violence. And of course, we've killed more than 50 million of the unborn since Roe v. Wade in 1973. The seeming liberation, pro-choice, subjects man to the dictatorship of the ruling majority, to shifting human standards, which inevitably end up doing him violence. Now, it's so important to note here that worship, civil law, and morality or ethics are all intimately connected, and they need to be intimately connected. Immediately after God gave Israel the Ten Commandments in Exodus 20, he gives them the rules for worship. He tells Moses how to build the tabernacle. He tells them how to offer sacrifices. God gives the rules for worship alongside the law which governs morality. Learning to love God is the path towards human redemption. He says, a society without God, like ours, a society that does not know God and treats him as non-existent, is a society that loses its measure. We lose our direction. We lose which way to go. In our day, the catchphrase of God's death was coined. Nietzsche in 1882 said that God is dead. Well, in 1900, God said Nietzsche is dead. Western society is a society in which God is absent in the public sphere and has nothing left to offer it. We feel like God is a fairy tale that we've grown out of since we've matured. But of course, we haven't matured. We've degenerated. And that is why it is a society in which the measure of humanity is increasingly lost. We don't understand the value of human beings. We don't understand the value of human life because we don't have God in the public sphere of our lives. We regulate him to 1 day a week for like an hour. So why did pedophilia reach such proportions, Benedict asks? Ultimately, the reason is the absence of God. We Christians and priests also prefer not to talk about God because this speech does not seem to be too practical. It doesn't seem pastoral. After the upheaval of the Second World War, we in Germany had still expressly placed our Constitution under the responsibility to God as a guiding principle. Half a century later, he continues, it was no longer possible to include responsibility to God as a guiding principle in a European constitution. God is regarded as the party concern of a small group, those fundamentalist Christians, and can no longer stand as the guiding principle for the community as a whole. This decision reflects the situation in the West, where God has become the private affair of a minority. And this we certainly find in the United States. A politician who's preeminently religious is belittled, whereas people who pride themselves on being secular are upheld. He says, above all, we ourselves must learn again to recognize God as the foundation of our life, instead of leaving him aside as a somehow ineffectual phrase. God bless you. Oh my God. These are things that we do. These are the words that we say that are completely ineffectual. So secondly, God became man for us. He says, let us consider this with regard to a central issue, the celebration of the Holy Eucharist. Our handling of the Eucharist can only arouse concern. And this is going to shock people, I think, when they hear this. Pope Benedict says, the Second Vatican Council was rightly focused on returning this sacrament of the presence of the body and blood of Christ, of the presence of his person, of his passion, death, and resurrection, to the center of Christian life and to the very existence of the Church. In part, this has really come about, and we should be more grateful to the Lord for it. He goes on to say, and yet a rather different attitude is prevalent. What predominates is not a new reverence for the presence of Christ's death and resurrection in the Eucharist, but a way of dealing with him that destroys the greatness of the mystery. What predominates is a way of dealing with God, with Jesus, in the Blessed Sacrament, that destroys the greatness of the mystery. The declining participation in the Sunday Eucharistic celebration shows how little we Christians of today still know about appreciating the greatness of the gift that consists in his real presence. The Eucharist is devalued into a mere ceremonial gesture when it is taken for granted that courtesy requires him to be offered at family celebrations or on occasions such as weddings and funerals to all those invited for family reasons. At my wedding, we had plenty of non-Catholic family members in attendance, but we don't invite them to receive the Eucharist. He's saying that the Eucharist is devalued into a mere ceremonial gesture, such that, we invite everyone, just come and receive. It doesn't matter if you're mortal sin, doesn't matter if you're not Catholic. Everyone is welcome here. This is the catchphrase. This is what people say. This is how they treat our Lord in the Blessed Sacrament. He says that it's a way of dealing with God, with Christ, that destroys the greatness of the mystery. This is such a painful thing to read. It's a painful thing to realize. He says, therefore, when thinking about what action is required, first and foremost, it's rather obvious that we do not need another church of our own design. We're not good at designing churches. Rather, what is required first and foremost is the renewal of the faith in the reality of Jesus Christ given to us in the Blessed Sacrament. And this reminds me of something that Bishop Strickland published in the Catholic East Texas magazine. Last summer of 2018, he published this Eucharistic edition of the Catholic East Texas. And in it, Bishop Strickland says, we must wake up to the truth that Jesus Christ comes to us in his body, blood, soul, and divinity at every single Mass. I'm very concerned by what I see in the Catholic Church today. I've written before in the Constitution on Teaching that I feel that a lack of belief in the real presence is a primary problem that we face in the Church today. We must all work to combat unbelief in our own lives and to help others come to understanding of and belief in this great truth. He says Bishop Strickland says, people are used to hearing words like invite and encourage, from their priests and bishops. And certainly we do invite and encourage everyone to come and see the goodness of God. However, I think the word, Bishop Strickland thinks the word demand also has a place in our discourse in the church. As a bishop, he demands that we take the real presence more seriously than we ever have. And you know what? If a diocese were to listen to a bishop like this, it would absolutely change the entire landscape. If just the Catholics started to see the Blessed Sacrament as important as it really is, if we started to consider our moral decisions more carefully, then our whole lives would change. The Catechism says that we would impregnate society with moral value. So going back to Pope Benedict, he says, let's see here. Indeed, the church today is widely regarded as just some kind of political apparatus. One speaks of it almost exclusively in political categories. The crisis caused by many cases of clerical abuse urges us to regard the church as something as almost unacceptable, which we must now take into our own hands and redesign. But he includes this important caveat. A self-made church cannot constitute hope. So the crisis caused by the many cases of clerical abuse urges us to regard the church as something almost unacceptable. But we must not take it into our own hands. Jesus himself, Pope Benedict goes on to say, compared the church to a fishing net in which good and bad fish are ultimately separated by God himself. There's also the parable of the church as a field on which the good grain that God himself has sown grows, but also the weeds that an enemy secretly sown into it. Indeed, the weeds in God's field, the church, are excessively visible, and the evil fish in the net also show their strength. Benedict says, nevertheless, the field is still God's field, and the net is God's fishing net. And at all times, there are not only the weeds and the evil fish, but also the crops of God and the good fish. To proclaim both with emphasis is not a false form of apologetics, but a necessary service to the truth. No matter how corrupt clergy become, it's still Jesus' church. We don't leave Jesus and we don't leave Peter because of Judas. Pope Benedict goes on to say in his conclusion, it's very important to oppose the lies and half-truths of the devil with the whole truth. We have to use the whole truth, the whole of moral truth, the whole of sacramental truth, the whole truth of the faith to oppose the devil's half-truths. Yes, there is sin in the church and evil, but even today there is the Holy Church which is indestructible. Today there are many people who humbly believe, suffer, and love, in whom the real God, the loving God, shows himself to us. Today God has also witnessed martyrs, witnesses to the faith in the world. We just have to be vigilant in order to see and hear them. At the end of his reflections, Pope Benedict goes on to thank Pope Francis for all that he is doing among this crisis, this horrible, horrible crisis. So I think it's important that in our lives we all pray for the victims of this crisis and for the criminals. As Christians, we need to want all of God's children to go to heaven. As difficult as it is to love our enemies, that's what Jesus calls us to do. Thank you so much for watching today. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the St. Philip Institute on YouTube. Follow us on Facebook. Leave a comment down below. I want to invite everyone into this dialogue. It's an important thing for us to consider. And let me know what kind of videos you want to see in the future. We're working really hard to put out at least a video a week. sometimes maybe it won't be live, but we do really enjoy doing these live broadcasts. And I've got a huge list of people who I'd like to invite on as guests. So be sure to subscribe, like this video, share it on Facebook if you enjoyed it. And thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time.